Welcome back to Whatcha Reading Wednesdays. Thanks for tuning in and spending time with us. Have you ever thought about how stories change to reflect our changing culture? Well, today we're talking about emerging genres from the last 20 years. Let's dig a little deeper, shall we? Do you think that genres are important in literature?
Well, for librarians, genres are important because we put some of our books in order by genre. A lot of people, it's important to them because they like to read the same genre. They read one, they like it, so they're going to relate to that genre, so they're going to keep reading from that genre. So that's important. Sometimes an author, a genre is important to them because that's the way they like to write. We do like to have people read across genres. And sometimes it's hard to get people to change because they found something they like, so they want to keep doing what they like.
I would have to agree with you. I think that genres are, I feel like they are important. I feel like genres are important because that's how most people read. They read by genre. If you go into a bookstore, it's categorized by genre. So you go to that nonfiction military section, you go to that romance section, you go to the children's section. I know I've been there where I've read all I can about this one author, but then I don't know what other authors are out there in the genre that I like.
And sometimes books cross so many genres, like one book will cross so many genres that I almost have to hear about it from another person to get a gist of what it's about. Because if I look it up, it might, the internet might put it in one genre, and I think that's all it is.
One of the Grand Forks Public Library's online resources, Novelist, which will let you punch in books that you like and genres that you enjoy, and it'll pull different options from across the board. It's pretty neat. Check it out.
I think Overdrive is doing that too, because I know I was looking for a book and I had to put it on hold, and down below it gave me a list of 4 or 5 other books. So I'm thinking they were similar to the book I was putting on hold.
So, Ernest, when you brought up the bookstore model, I think it was a great example because that's how they do, place their books. However, the only thing that I don't like is that YA books are just put together no matter what. And those don't tend to be separated by genre, even though I think we touched on this earlier or elsewhere, but YA tends to be where you find those like emerging genres the most. And so for me, when you walk into a bookstore and you're looking for YA, but it's all together, you kind of don't know what you're getting. So you kind of just like give up maybe because you're overwhelmed or something. So while I agree that genres are important, I wish that YA books got the same sort of treatment as everything else, considering they are kind of the ones introducing most of this new stuff to us.
Also where we find YA is also where we have new authors come out a lot of times. It's that in between of that tween and that adult stage that a lot of new authors come out in the YA realm. And it's also a very interesting tester field because it covers so many. It covers almost like from the age of 12 to 25, which a lot of life is happening between those ages,
And at that age, they're probably not going to ask for help too, even like in the library. They'll look, and if they don't find anything, they'll either take something because they have to have some kind of free reading or something, or they'll just leave and say, oh, forget this, I'm not coming back.
I also think that's why the YA section is underutilized in a lot of libraries, is because maybe it's not genrefied, and it needs to be.
Fun fact for our viewers, did you know the term young adult was coined by librarians? Yeah, in the early 1900s, librarians from the New York Public Library worked together to curate a collection from both the adult and children's collections that would be interest of teens, because that wasn't like a thing. And it was actually Margaret Scoggin, who was from New York Public, her column in the Library Journal was books for older boys and girls, and so she replaced that for young adult, and it's stuck ever since.
Nice.
And our young adult books used to be together with the regular fiction, so they were
Mhm.
hard to find, and I fought for a long time until we finally got them separated. So that was
Yay,
very happy.
Mary.
I was happy to get that separated, because even though the young adult nonfiction and biographies probably don't circulate much, at least the fiction, they know it's all stuff that they probably are going to find something they enjoy.
Not every book fits into a particular genre. Give us an example of fluidity within a genre.
I've read the Ink series by Sonia B, which is paranormal about shapeshifters, but it's also about their relationships and how they meet their true mate. So I do think then, yeah, there is some type of fluidity as a prime example. And because we're complex, I think that the books tend to be complex with multiple themes in them a lot of times too, that people want to speak to or speak about.
My mind immediately went to Andy Weir's The Martian, where it's, you know, it's part comedy, part fiction, part sci-fi, grounded sci-fi, hard sci-fi. But also Shirley Jackson wrote a number of coming-of-age novels that also function as horror books, which I think is great. Things like We've Always Lived in the Castle, to me, is, you know, it crosses genre lines. And I think the subgenre, we didn't really talk about it, but any of those books that have like mythical gods, like the Rick Riordan young adult, I think, you know, can kind of straddle genres as well, but I think it's also its own subgenre, so
Well, I was going to say, to branch off of what Ernesto was saying, you know, books that hold my attention tend to cross more genres, rather than have like just the romance or whatever, because we are complex human beings. And so I want to read a story that's more complex and where the characters are well-rounded. An example of a book that I just read is called This Is How You Lose the Time War. It was really interesting because they're kind of these shapeshifter. Also, I listened to the audiobook and they're both read by female voices. So I take that as like a queer love story also. But it was definitely fantasy as well.
See, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about those J.D. Robb books that are definitely a police crime novel, but they're set in the future. But I was wondering, since we have Erin on here, is there fluidity in nonfiction?
Yeah, and actually a huge part of the nonfiction that I love the most leans on interdisciplinary styles of research and writing. The marriage of history and anthropology has been a lot of fun in the recent days.
I read a lot of nonfiction as well, and on boring stuff like time management and productivity tips. So Laura Vanderkam wrote the book Off the Clock, which I thought was great, but if you're not into that kind of thing, it's probably very boring. But Juliet's School of Possibilities is her fiction book about the same concepts, but done in a way that it's a fiction book and it's a story. So she teaches the same things about productivity and makes it fun. So I want to go back and read that one with the same ideas.
The same author wrote both?
Yes.
Oh, that's fun.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
She's grabbing people that are not necessarily going to pick up a nonfiction book and then still probably get the same information out of it.
Exactly.
Angie kind of sparked it, and I was thinking of it before, but I think any fiction book that's written that pulls inspiration from something that really happened, like The Girls by Emma Cline, is sort of inspired by Charles Manson and that sort of thing. There's one that just came out, Darling Rose Gold, that pulled a lot of inspiration from the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case. So for me, stuff like that, where you know names and stuff have changed, but it's very much inspired by a true life event or nonfiction. I feel like that's pretty genre fluid, in my opinion.
I think about some great biographies on John and Abigail Adams that are framed as a love story, as opposed to like he was born in Boston and so it's, yeah.
So nonfiction that's more of a narrative. So it's written more like in story form instead of just being straight facts all the time.
I think historians are finally starting to glom onto that. Not all of them, but it's there's still some duds.
Do you think that some genres are dying out, and why do you think that is?
I'm so glad you asked. Just to touch on some of the genres that popped up in the late 90s, early aughts that dealt with technology, like the LOL text you later sort of emoji books came and went. Thank God. But the one I did a deep dive on was Western genres. And I almost wish we had an entire session to itself to talk about dying genres because there's just so much information. But the big thing that I took away from Westerns is that it leans heavily on false nostalgia and awesome times very like racist, misogynistic ideas of like man versus nature, man versus the savage nature. It's a whole nother conversation. A lot of the folks who grew up with those are no longer reading or dying off, and the publishing just hasn't found a way to recover.
Do you think they'll ever come back?
You know, if they can reinvent themselves, I think of HBO's Westworld as a good example of modern Westerns kind of meet sci-fi. I don't know if you call it steampunk, but you know, there are some really interesting like post-apocalyptic takes in video games. Look at the Fallout series by Bethesda. I think it's going to have to do some work. I think it needs to remember that the reality, most cowboys were Black and Hispanic, and the reason we say things like buckaroo is because they couldn't pronounce vaquero. So it's, you know, it's going to have to face some hard truths that I think some Western readers don't necessarily want to.
I was going to say chick lit has kind of disappeared too.
Thank God.
Because it's the rudest title.
You know, I know, and I read a little
Rude
bit
and
on
it's
it.
predominantly white, single, and I'm just like,
Professional women.
I
Yeah,
live that.
professional
I don't
women.
need to read it.
Right.
Like, don't single me out, okay? I get it. Like, I can do whatever I want, even if I'm white and single. Like, yeah, I get it.
Well, and they started writing those when times were really good in the country. You know, people had a lot of money. These women could have their jobs, their fancy apartments, they could go shopping, they could do all this stuff. And then when that economy started dropping a little bit, it was kind of like, oh, we don't see these people. We're not going to relate to them. We're not going to read them.
At one point, you know,
Aaron, I'll talk about Aaron's favorite thing.
I know.
It blew my mind, you guys.
So one of the things that happened that people was kind of I guess is kind of controversial was just the fact that 50 Shades of Grey pretty much bringing back booksellers like Barnes & Noble back to life after a really bad 2011 year. The 50 Shades of Grey came out. They originally lost almost 57 million the year before. It went down in that very first quarter, it went down to 41. They were losing like 41 million instead. And then they just kind of climbed their way back up. Just so people know that 50 Shades of Grey still is, I want to say the fastest selling paperback book of all time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you have a book recommendation that fits within an emerging genre?
I would recommend read Heartstopper by Alice Oseman, and also Check Please by Ngozi Ukazu. They're both, again, queer love stories, but they are, Heartstopper is about young adults, and then I think Check Please could technically be new adult because it's a college setting, but those are my recommendations.
A new book, I don't know if it's even out yet since we're not in the library. I don't know if we've gotten it yet. It fits into that Latino fiction, and it's called Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Moreno Garcia.
I want to read that.
I know, I want to read it too. It's supposed to be really good. So that's my pick.
I really think people should read The Parable of the Sower for climate fiction. It's so good, and Octavia Butler is fantastic. And then, you know what, go ahead and read The Martian by Andy Weir. It's not really, it's more realistic sci-fi, I guess. It's usually in the fiction section. And it was a film starring Matt Damon.
I went in a totally different direction. So I've got A Simplified Life by Emily Lay. She is a planner, designer, and influencer. So kind of that whole, online platform, and then creates a book, and it relates to the product that she makes, which is planners. And then also just starting Untamed, the audiobook by Glennon Doyle. And she's, again, a very influential online person.
I've heard really good things about that book.
Yeah.
Me too.
And that cover is just
Pretty.
Fabulous.
yes.
Last year I reread Brokeback Mountain, just, is like, it seemed like the movie, while I think it's well respected now, I think it was like the butt of a lot of jokes after it came out. And I just read the little 55-page short novel that Annie Proulx wrote. And it is set in Wyoming, which is a place that I've been to many, many times. And it was just kind of like this beautiful little love story that was also very nostalgic for me. And then also currently I'm reading a new book called Here For It, or How to Save Your Soul in America by R. Eric Thomas. And it's actually nonfiction, so somewhat out of my comfort zone. But it's essays that he wrote about being a gay Black man in America during this time. And I'm really enjoying it so far.
Okay, so I have a couple for Urban Lit. I said Coldest Winter Ever by Sister Souljah. It's one of the first, I went kind of old school with all this Urban Lit, kind of some of the first Urban Lit that kind of changed, put Urban Lit kind of on the map. And that was one of the books, Coldest Winter Ever. I would say Gangsta by Kay Kwan is another one, or Hood Rat, that was another book. Sweet St. Louis by Omar Tyree. And I also have Sister Sister, Friends and Lovers, and Milk in My Coffee. They're all 3 different books by Eric Jerome Dickey.
So I kind of racked my brain trying to find some good titles that stood out. And 2 that stood out to me was The Prince and the Dressmaker by Jen Wang. It's a graphic novel, and it's under the genres of LGBTQ and romance and historical. And then Nimona by Noelle Stevenson is like a young adult fantasy. And I think those are 2 like good ones, especially for people who kind of want to get into the medium, because they're standalone and they're both like cute in their own ways.
That about wraps up this episode of Whatcha Reading Wednesdays. Thanks again for joining us. As always, let us know if you have specific requests or topic ideas. We'll be back next week, same time, same place. Stay well, stay home, stay curious. Take care. Bye-bye.